We are very happy to have John Sabelhaus today, our own John, to present at the Financial Literacy Seminar Series. I know that John doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going still to introduce him a little for some of you might not know him, and also to tell you how much experience John has on this topic. John is the chief of the microeconomic survey section at the Federal Reserve Board, but formerly he was the chief of long-term projection at the Congressional Budget Office. And I think he brings today so much experience on this important topic about early withdrawals from retirement account during the Great Recession. There has always been a lot of interest between the link of kind of financial literacy, but certainly the topic of retirement security. And I think these issues about leakage from the retirement account is very, very important. And John really has great data to bring to this topic. So welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Anna. This is really a pleasure to move to the other side of the financial literacy series. I've been on the organizing side for, I guess this is our second year now. And I will start by telling my favorite story about the financial literacy seminar series, how I got involved, which is Anna had a meeting. She got in to see Chairman Bernanke one day and was talking to him about financial literacy, and I'm not sure what transpired in that meeting. All I know is the next day I came to work and I had a phone call very early, and it said, and the person on the other end of the phone said, "Give Anna anything she wants," and that's what we've been doing ever since. So it's been very a great partnership to work with GW and put this series together. So today I'm going to be talking about early withdrawals from retirement accounts. And one of my co-authors who's here, Robert Argento from the Federal Reserve Board. Unfortunately, Victoria Bryant couldn't join us today. She's with the Statistics of Income Division. And we have to have our usual government disclaimer that anything we say does not indicate concurrence by the Board of Governors or the IRS. So, why are we here today? Well, we in the U.S., we've had a big shift from a defined benefit pension system to one that's participant-driven, self-directed retirement accounts. And when we allow people to manage their own money, make decisions about putting money in and how to allocate it and taking money out, we open the door to leakage from retirement accounts. Meaning people are taking money out before they hit retirement, either directly early withdrawals from their IRAs or their 401ks, or more generally their failure to roll over a cash settlement when they separate from an employer. In some cases, there are also failure to pay back loans. Again, these are often tied in with having separated from the employer anyway, so it's the same sort of idea that when people have access to their funds, they actually take advantage of that and take withdrawals. It's really important before we start to acknowledge that if you were going to design a system like this from scratch, and Congress had this in mind when they designed our system, you would never want to make it impossible to take money out. And in fact, studies have showed that if people can't get access to their funds under certain circumstances, they wouldn't contribute as much in the first place. So it's not clear that the alternative universe in which there were no withdrawals is one in which balances were higher because contributions might have been lower as well. So that's an important qualifying condition. But there's also buried in there a statement that says something about the conditions, the circumstances under which people are taking money out of their accounts. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. The primary goals of this bit of research are understanding how big leakage is and understanding the circumstances associated with pre-retirement withdrawals. So you might wonder, why is it that we're here in a financial literacy seminar series? And I chatted a lot about this, whether the paper fit in, and I think it does. We both agree it does, because to some extent, understanding how big this problem is a first step in understanding whether or not we really think households are making mistakes with respect to managing their retirement funds. It's not obvious because we have these competing objectives. So at least getting a handle on exactly what's happening is a good starting point. So to get you thinking about retirement accounts, self-directed accounts, I want to spend a few slides on data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, the project that Robert and I work on at the board, And we'll also use some data from the statistics of income, the SOI tax data, that's going to underlie the second half of the paper. Both of these data sets show us that participation in self-directed accounts and account balances for much of the less than 55 population, this pre-retirement group we're focused on today, that these account balances and participation are actually fairly modest. There is a good reason to expect that, we'll see a huge distributional difference in retirement account balances across income groups. Social Security replaces a much higher fraction of lifetime earnings for lower income families. Those replacement rates fall very nonlinearly with income. What we're really focused on today is what's happening, how are these distributions changing over the past few years, this period leading up to and subsequent to the Great Recession. So the time period that you see along the horizontal axis here is one that we'll be talking about today. Most of what we did in this project was to pull together SCF data and SOI data for this 6-year period. And so what we're looking at is some evidence of retirement accounts or current pension coverage for families headed by someone where the oldest person, the older of the primary or the spouse, is less than 55 years of age. So this pre-retirement group. And here we split them into 3 groups, 45 to 54, 35 to 44, and then less than 35. And so at any point in time, you sort of see a predictable life cycle increase in participation or evidence of accumulated accounts in any of the years. But the troubling part of this, and in fact for families headed by someone 45 to 54, you see evidence, in 2004, 75% of families had either current coverage or some accumulated accounts at that time. But when we look over this period, we're starting to see some concern, right? What got us into this paper in the first place, that evidence of coverage is down. It doesn't matter which of the 2 data sets we use, whether we're looking at tax data or whether we're looking at the survey data from the SCF, we're seeing declines of a couple percentage points. So after a long sort of boom in participation in these types of accounts, we're starting to see things tail off a little bit. I'm going to show you 2 pictures of distributions, whether you like percentiles along the x-axis or the y-axis. You can pick whichever one you like. They're both going to tell us the same story. But what we see here is retirement account balances by percentile. So we're looking, again, distributionally using the SCF. And the percentile of retirement account balances in this picture, notice that I have to go to the 50th percentile of families before we even get to any retirement account balances. Half the families don't have any evidence of IRAs or 401ks. And then by the time we get up to about the 75th percentile, we're still at a fairly modest amount, $25,000, $30,000 for that group. Again, we're talking about families less than 55. So we're not seeing a lot of accumulation at this point. But again, what we're focused on today is changes over time. And so during this period between 2004 and 2010, we see an increase in balances at most percentiles, but then a subsequent decline between 2004 and 2010, again at most percentiles. And you can see the same thing if you look at it from a cumulative distribution perspective in terms of the dollars. Obviously, a lot of this is because of return on investment. The stock market fell over this period. That's part of why the distribution shifted. But there's other reasons to believe that what's happening to low and middle income families might have something to do with withdrawals from their accounts. And so what this table does, it uses the SCF. We can't look at withdrawals directly from the SCF. There's some measure, but it's not quite comprehensive. That's why we use the tax data for most of this paper. But in the SCF, we can look at the level of contributions at a point in time, and we can look at the level of balances at a point in time. And the difference between these contributions and these balances obviously tells us something about possibly about withdrawals or differences in rates of return across groups. So what we've done is we've organized the data, organized the sample by normal income. So this is a measure of usual income in the SCF. So we ask families at the end of the survey what their actual income was, and then we say, what would your income be if this had been a normal year? And in 2010, obviously it was not a normal year for a lot of people, many families reported their income was below normal, and so they tell us what their normal income is. This is a concept, what I guess economists would think of as a permanent income measure. So it's a good way to classify families, sort of a lifetime income measure. And what we see when we look across these quartiles of normal income, how is labor income, the share of labor income allocated across families? And the SCF, because it oversamples the highest income families and truly represents the entire population, drives home a point that a lot of people in this room don't need to see over and over again. The highest 25% of families account for 56% of labor income. The third quartile accounts for 22%. We get to the bottom quartile of labor income, and again, this is families less than 55. It's not like we have retirees in here. Low earnings mean that they only account for 6.8% of labor income. So the other two columns tell us something about the relationship between what's flowing in and how much balances are for each of these income groups at any point in time, and so in this case 2010. And what we see is that the lowest quartile of by normal income, they account for 6.8% of income, but they only account for 2% of populations. Again, going back to the Social Security point, they're less likely to contribute in the first place, in part because Social Security is going to give them a higher replacement rate. The other income groups, we still see for the second quartile, right? They contribute less than their share of income, and at the top two groups account for a disproportionate share. But when we look at retirement account balances, we see that there's an even disproportionate amount of balances that are held at these lower income levels. At the bottom, the contributions and balances are both very small shares. But if we look at these next two groups, the second quartile accounts for 8.4% of contributions and yet only 6% of balances. The third quartile, 23.6% of contributions, yet only 19.4% of balances. So this suggests that there might be something going on distributionally in terms of people's tendency to take money out of their retirement accounts after they put it in. Okay, so what am I going to do today? We want to, this was all background to get us started, get us motivated, thinking about why it's important to think about withdrawals. And the first question we're going to ask is, did early withdrawals from IRAs and DC plans increase during the Great Recession? So a pretty straightforward question. That's how we got into this project in the first place. The second question, what demographic and economic factors are going to be associated with withdrawals and cash outs of distributions? And third, which we'll kind of hint at a little bit, and tying this into the financial literacy, the ultimate agenda of getting people to manage their money better, is there some failure in terms of policy associated with how distributions are made that could be addressed by policy. Changes in the way that people are handed their money when they separate from an employer, for example, that if we did something a little bit different, they might be more likely to preserve their balances. In the same sense that defaults helped, for example, in terms of improving contribution behavior, there might be similar sorts of policy steps to take on the withdrawal side. Most of the data we're going to look at from this point forward is from the statistics of income cross-sections. So for those of you who don't know, the IRS maintains the statistics of income program where they take samples of tax returns. These are weighted samples to represent the whole population. It looks a lot like our SCF in terms of oversampling of the wealthy in order to get good representation. If you've never used the data, you can find it online. The SOI publishes really extensive, great information about income distribution based on tax returns. And 1040s, for those of you who've ever had any kind of pension distribution, you know that on a 1040 you're supposed to report any gross distribution that you get from a pension as well as any taxable distribution. These are those two columns you have on the front of 1040. But in practice, most distribution, not most, but many distribution events go unreported because the taxpayer knows the event is non-taxable. So Victoria, who's not here today, my co-author, has spent a lot of time, and she and I wrote an earlier paper where we focused on how it is you can use the tax data to measure this. And again, for those of you who've received these sorts of returns, these distributions over your life, you'll recognize what a 1099-R is. It's a distribution from a pension plan. A 5498 is a contribution to an IRA. And we use this combination of information returns to get accurate cross-section snapshots of exactly what was flowing out of retirement plans and whether or not those distributions ended up in a taxable or a penalized event. And one thing you see, for example, is that if you just process 1040s, you'd be missing about 20% of gross distributions, mainly because, and again, for those of you who've ever changed jobs and rolled your 401k over, by law you're supposed to report it as a gross distribution, but then not as a taxable distribution. Some of you might not have. Don't worry, the IRS is probably not coming after you because it's a non-taxable event, and that's why you have to go to these other data sources to do it. So the first part of the paper is going to use multiple SOI cross-sections. Just want to give you a quick sense and draw your attention to some red numbers real quickly. But this is a table for 2010, and it shows you the result of doing all of these tabulations with these information returns for 1 year. And there's 3 sets of columns. Each one has millions of returns and billions of dollars. And we split the population into the people we're talking about today, less than 55 and 55 and older. And so if you go to the top and you look at gross distributions, the amount coming out of pensions, $1.281 trillion in 2010 came out of pensions. That's a pretty big number, about a tenth of GDP. And for less than 55 is a much smaller share of that, $241 billion. Most of it went to people over age 55. You can see what sorts of things happen for a distribution to make it non-taxable. It's a direct rollover. It might be an indirect rollover. This is where those information returns become really important, because if we see somebody who took a distribution that looks taxable, but then they put it in an IRA, we can find them and we calculate their indirect rollover. Other sorts of things. A Section 1035 exchange is a sort of annuity that you can get. And at the bottom, the stuff that's, you take out the non-taxable, what's left is taxable. This is the leakage that we're worried about, and your definition of leakage, depending on how you want to think about it, there are some withdrawals from accounts that are not penalized. So as, for example, taking money out for a first-time home purchase or for education, certain education expenditures would not be a penalized withdrawal. So you can switch back and forth between your measures as you want. I'll talk about both taxable and penalized as we go. But the red numbers I want to draw your attention to for this less than 55 population confirms what a lot of this literature on accessing retirement accounts has shown before, in the following sense. Most people who have a gross distribution, so in our data 65%, most people who have a gross distribution, at least some of that is going to end up as being a taxable withdrawal. They're going to access some of the money. And in fact, 40% of the people, 39%, have a penalized withdrawal. But most dollars are not taken out when that distribution occurs. So 43% of the dollars are taxable, 20% of the dollars are penalized. And these are the numbers that we're most focused on, these fractions of the distributions that end up subject to withdrawal, and what we'll be talking about in terms of evolving over time. So why would we expect withdrawals to have risen? I threw this slide at the last minute. Hopefully everybody came here with this idea in mind. The reason we're worried about the past 6 years, the Great Recession, gross distributions might be up, so we might be showing people the money. This is a title from a paper by Len Berman a few years ago, What Happens When You Show Them the Money, which was about retirement account withdrawals. I really like the title, and I think it's a great way to think about it. What happens when you show them the money? So more people may be seeing the money because there were more job separations over the past few years, and they simply had access to the money they didn't have before. Also, it could be that conditional on having received a cash settlement, you separated from an employer, you had access to the funds, or just having a balance in general, increased hardship, so the sorts of hardships we're well aware of for the past few years, have led to increased cashing out and account withdrawals. So I'm going to first show you some pictures on the number of taxpayers with early withdrawals and then dollar amounts. So this is the most exciting slide of the presentation. So when you're doing a project like this and you go and you say, I want to study something that happened during the most shocking period of time that we've lived through, and this would be one of the ways that we would expect people to have reacted very dramatically to these trying economic circumstances, and you end up with three very flat lines. The first thing you do is check your code, and then the second thing you do is you sit back and you think about it a little bit more. We check the code, and it turns out the flat lines are right. So what are these flat lines telling us? The fraction of tax units with any type of retirement account distribution, so the numbers of people who are accessing their retirement accounts as a fraction of all taxpayers, didn't change much. Well, I told you that the fraction of taxpayers who actually have retirement accounts went down. So first thing we can do is add a little bit of slope to these lines by dividing through, not by all taxpayers, but saying among those who had retirement plan coverage of some kind, either they had evidence of retirement account balances or they were currently covered and therefore there were some funds they could access. Because that denominator is going down, the overall ratio is going up a bit. But again, when you step back and you look at this and you look at these reasons why withdrawals might have taken off in this period, you're not seeing anything. It certainly seems to be timed, at least what's happening after 2007. There doesn't seem to be much takeoff, and there doesn't seem to still be a lot of movement in any case. But the other thing you see when you look at these numbers is that they're pretty high to begin with. That, for example, 12–15% of families families who have evidence of coverage had a withdrawal in all of these years. It wasn't just the years after, during and after the Great Recession. It's something that seems to be more pervasive, more persistent. Again, that'll become a theme as we go through the talk. If we look at the fraction of gross distribution returns that are taxable or penalized, here we start to see a little bit of a U-shape, the sort of U-shape we might expect, where it's going to tick up after the recession in terms of taxable and penalized. Again, we're still focused on numbers of taxpayers over this time period. And if we look at it as a share of income, here we see a little bit more upward slope. But again, there's nothing here that you would think of as being sort of a first order change. When the one picture I think that does capture the spirit of what we would have expected to have happen is looking at distributions as a share, taxable and penalized distributions as a share of all distributions. So this is conditional on having received some sort of distribution from your employer. The fraction of that was taxable or penalized did go up after 2007. But again, you step back and you look at this, and if you're looking for first order effects of the recession, it's going to be, I think it's difficult to argue that you see that clearly. A fraction of dollars that fell from close to 40% to the mid-30s and then back up to just over 40%. I think it's more fair to say that the fraction of taxable distributions taken out is high in every year, with a little bit of a cyclical effect. So to summarize this, there was some uptick in withdrawals. So the first objective we had for the paper was to look at what's happening over time. And there's some uptick in withdrawals, but to some extent, it's just the fact that retirement access is substantial in all of these years. It's not that the shock of what happened during the recession is what's driving increased withdrawals from accounts. And also, if you want to put this into more perspective, we have one more graph where we bring back data from the SEF. Again, the SEF is very useful for measuring contributions and balances. And so what this chart does is to look at gross and net contributions to retirement accounts in each of these 3 years for which we have the SEF, 2004, 2007, and 2010. So we're measuring contributions as a fraction of labor income in the SEF for each of these 3 years. And we see it's down slightly. So this number, just over 3% of labor income as measured in the SEF, becomes qualified contributions in a given year. And we see that's down a few tenths of a percent. And then we look at our taxable distributions, again as a fraction of labor income, these taxable distributions measured from the tax data, and we see that's up a few tenths. And the net change is where you start to see some real action, and you start to it's the combination of the two, and in fact about half and half, that explains why net contributions to retirement accounts are down. And here you start getting into some noticeable numbers where you're in the mid-twos, a net contribution rate in the mid-twos in 2004, and you're down to well below 2% by 2010. Another way to put this, in one of my favorite statistics, if I take the ratio of this bar to this bar, so how much for every dollar that goes into the accounts in a given year, how much leaks out of the accounts. Again, we're staying within this age group less than 55. How much comes out relative to what goes in? So the answer is this was about 30 cents on the dollar in 2004. And it's not necessarily the same people, but for every dollar that went in for this age group, 30 cents came out. By the time we get to 2010, that's up closer to 50 cents on the dollar. That for every dollar that went in, I think it's 45, 46 cents or something like that came out. So there has been a noticeable change. It's something that we should be worried about, but one way to interpret this is that the decline in contributions is at least as substantial as the increase in withdrawals. The other part of what we did with the tax data is to start asking the question. So we're seeing these very substantial withdrawals. How much of the withdrawal activity that's occurring is due to things that, going back to the first slide, we're worried that families experience shocks as they go through life. And we say we put the system in place that allows them to respond to their shocks by taking money out. And so, some of the other things, the other presentations we've seen here at the literacy series, it might be a much better alternative than, for example, high-cost borrowing to be able to access your account. One could argue that that the fact that we know families are going to experience these shocks is a good reason that people should be contributing more in the first place, and I would probably make that argument. But what we should acknowledge that these shocks are going to occur. So now it's about quantifying those shocks. How much of what we're seeing here is because of families experiencing these shocks? So in order to do this, we need to go beyond these SOI cross sections. Just one point in time we're observing these families, and adding a panel dimension. And for those of you who've worked with tax data, tax panels are extremely complicated because life is extremely complicated. I guess all panels are complicated, but the tax data is more complicated because a lot of people bounce in and out of being required to file a 1040, for example. If your income falls enough, you have certain types of income, you actually disappear out of the tax system. One of the nice things about using our information returns is that people don't necessarily disappear for us. If they were getting certain types of income, we can actually keep track of them even if they're not doing a 1040. What we do is we took a new approach. There's new data sources that IRS is making available through a population data set, the compliance data warehouse, for those of you who know the lingo. And what we do is we take our cross sections at a point in time, and if it's just a single filer, we take for that person and we look back several years and we get all of their earlier tax returns. Or if it's a joint filer, we look back for both the primary and the secondary, and we get their tax returns. And in this first cut at doing this, we were experimenting with this new way of building this look-back panel, and we only focused on a couple of measures for this first paper. And so we're focused on demographic changes in this case. Marital shocks in particular, so you're changing your marital status. And then we're going to focus on income changes, being a large drop in adjusted gross income. And so these two shocks, I'll talk a little bit about those. The first is a negative marital shock. So these are shocks that we would expect to be correlated with your tendency to take money out of your retirement account. We're interested in how families responded when they experienced these shocks. And so we say in the tax data that you experienced a negative marital shock in the past 2 years if, remember, on a tax return, nobody asks you questions about your spouse or anything like that, or when you were married, but the information is implicitly there. And so if we see that you are a non-joint filer this year, and so non-joint filer means you're either single, head of household, married filing separately, or widow-widower, and in one of those previous years for which we found your data, you were a joint filer, then you have gone from being married to being not married, one way or another. Or if we say, this is our quick turnaround population, if you're a joint filer this year and you were a joint filer in the previous years, but you had a different co-filer in those earlier returns, it's obviously possible that you could have remarried within the same year that you divorced, then we would also say you experienced a marital shock. What's interesting is we can compute the fraction who experienced a shock, and we can compare this to survey data where these questions are asked directly. So on the SCF, we ask every respondent and every spouse partner in the data set, what's your marital status? And if they tell us they were divorced, widowed, separated, we ask when did it happen? And we find that within the 2-year window that we're looking back, almost the exact same 6% number. So this tells us we're doing a good job of capturing this shock in the tax data, even though we're not measuring it by asking people directly, we're measuring it by their filing status. Same thing we do with income. So here we take, and again, just a first simple measure of what a negative income shock would mean, a 10% or more drop in adjusted gross income. We need to subtract out from adjusted gross income taxable pensions, because if you respond to the shock by taking money out of your retirement account, it might appear as though you didn't have a shock, but in fact it was the taking out of the retirement account that was driven by the initial shock. So we subtract taxable pensions from AGI, we compute that number, we do changes per capita just in case if you were married in a $100,000 couple last year, you're single in a $50,000 household this year, we would say your AGI didn't change, so it's per capita. And again, we can compare this to a similar measure from the Survey of Consumer Finances, where it goes back to this normal income question that I told you about earlier. So we in the FCF say that families self-report a transitory income shock if they tell us that their actual income is below their normal income. We say, okay, they've experienced an income shock. And that number that we get for this fraction of a 10% or more drop in AGI is roughly the same as the fraction in the SCF who say, my actual income is 10% or more below my normal income. So again, a lot of good validation going in. So what do these shocks look like? Overall, I told you on average, just over 20% had the income shock, just over or almost 6% had the marital shock. And so what I've done, I've collapsed down a much longer table in the paper, and I'm showing it for 3 income deciles. So the 1st, the 5th, and the 10th income decile. This is a straight up tabulation using your current year income. So in the year in which we're interested, which everything I'm going to show you from now on is 2010, what your current year income was. It's not surprising that 57% of the people in the bottom income group say that they experienced an income shock between 2009 and 2010. That's how you ended up in the lowest income group in 2010. So that doesn't surprise us. But when you look, though the fraction of people, and this same sort of thing we see in the SCF, by the way, that these income shocks over this period were very widespread across the distribution. You still have 13% of families in the highest income group saying they experienced a shock. So what is this second column and fourth column? So these 3-year average income, what you want to do is, what we're trying to do here is to get past this endogeneity where you're automatically in the bottom income group just because you had this income shock. So what we do is we average over this year's income plus the last 2, and that becomes your classifier. So this moves us more towards an average income, a lifetime income concept, and you see much less difference across the income distribution in terms of the fraction who are experiencing the drop. So again, obviously you still have 21% of families experiencing the drop, but you rearrange them a little bit. It's not, being in the bottom quintile doesn't make it as likely that you were the one who experienced the drop. I put the marital shocks up here for basically to show you that, and we would expect this to be the case, there's not nearly as much difference across the income distribution in terms of whether you experience the shock, but to the extent that it's there, it makes a lot of sense. If you were a person who's in the lowest income group, you're a little bit more likely than people in higher income groups to have experienced a marital shock in that year. Your income, which might have been dependent on a spouse in the past, is now dependent only on your own. So this is the main construct that we're going to use to try and identify how the shocks affected different types of families by income, to try and tie back to this underlying distributional question of who it is that's taking money out of their accounts and under what circumstances. So a quick, just top line snapshot. Again, this is a cross-section in 2010. Looking across income groups, and I went ahead, and even though I'm going to change up this horizontal axis on you because these deciles refer to either the current year, and that's this blue line, or it refers to the 3-year average, that's the red line. So the decile is going to change based on whether it's current year or 3-year average. But in both cases, what we see is that the probability that you took out, the percent of tax units who have evidence of coverage, right? So this is not all tax units, just those who had evidence of coverage. The fraction who took money out of their accounts falls with income. That's the first simple takeaway from this. But the second, and again, it's a theme I'll harp on a little bit, is that it's high for everybody. It's not as though the highest income decile, measured either by current income or the 3-year income, they're less likely to have accessed their accounts. This is just the observation that you took money out of an account. They're less likely to have accessed it, but it's not as though it's a night and day difference. There's a substantial difference, but this activity occurs across the income distribution. So we'll take this to do to a formal econometric test where we're modeling these withdrawal probabilities directly. And so the dependent variable in these equations is taxable withdrawal equals 1. We could have done it penalized withdrawal equals 1. That's certainly on the list of things to do in the future. The population is tax units with evidence of any pension coverage or accounts. This group I've been talking about, ages less than 55. And we're going to rerun these regressions completely dummied up when you have life is wonderful when you have tax data and you have hundreds of thousands of observations. And so we can take our 3 age groups. This gets to your point, Camilla. So everything is done differently for less than 35, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, and then each one of those split between married and single, right? So a total of 6 demographic groups as the core control. There's a presence of kids at home and away. For those of you who have children, it probably won't surprise you. This is a pretty good indicator of whether you're going to take money out of your retirement account. And then a bunch of interactions. So these income deciles, these are just dummies for each income decile. Again, we're estimating a probability, so we're just trying to draw out differences across income groups. And then the income shock measure, your income dropped less than by 10% or more between 2009 and 2010, and completely interacted with all the income deciles. So this makes it possible that a high-income person who experienced the shock might respond differently to the shock than a low-income person who experienced the shock. And we'll do the same with marital shocks, again, interacting with income deciles. And what this allows us to do, I could show you a page of regression coefficients, and you can do the math and figure out you'd have 6 coefficients, another 2, and then 10, 10, 10. So I could show you 40 coefficients. I can guarantee you when you have hundreds of thousands of observations, everything comes insignificant. But what you really want to do at the end of the day is to draw pictures like this. And what this picture shows us is the predicted withdrawal rate. So these come directly out of the estimates across deciles of current year non-pension per capita income. So this is our core income measure where we're sorting people by their non-pension income. And we map out the estimated probability of a taxable withdrawal. And again, we've got a bunch of dummy variables interacted with income deciles. And so this point represents, this is the withdrawal probability for someone in the bottom decile of income who experienced no shock whatsoever. So they didn't have the income shock and they didn't have the marital shock. So you can read off, there are about 15% of that group took money out from their retirement account. And you look up quite a bit, and you see that among the population, again, this is the group who had retirement accounts, that among that group, if you were in the bottom decile and you experienced a shock, 35% of that population took some sort of taxable withdrawal. So right off the bat, this question of do income shocks seem to be correlated with taking money out of your account? The answer is a resounding yes. The second question is, does the level of income matter? Is it more likely that you took money out of your account when you had a shock if you were a low-income person to begin with? And again, there seems to be some evidence that this is the case, especially when we get out to the very highest income groups. Experiencing a shock doesn't raise the probability of taking a withdrawal by as much as it does at lower income levels. Go ahead. Population is tax units with evidence of pension coverage. Right.
It can change a little bit of the sample selections, right? I mean, you essentially have to get people who have very low income, but somehow they do have these accounts. I mean,
Right. No, that's a good point. We struggled a little bit with the classifier, whether or not to do deciles. Let me try something on you, because you may actually have an answer for this. You could rank people. So these are deciles where the population that we're ranking is only those who has the retirement accounts. So this is not the bottom decile of the population. It's the bottom decile of those who have retirement accounts. The other way we could have done it is the way you're I think, imagining, which is that if we did sort it and we used population deciles, well, there'd be many fewer of them down there, but they'd be even probably, their reaction would be even stronger.
I'm just thinking like, perhaps one of the reasons why you are not finding too much of an effect is that actually the people who need it, that you know, who need access to savings or whatever, who will be actually drawing, trying to insure their shops, are actually the people who really don't have access. So that's particularly big.
So I don't think I'd call this not too much of an effect. So I think I'd call this a pretty big. I'd call this a pretty big effect. If you have the shock, you're much more likely to take a withdrawal.
Maybe it would be even more.
Okay, I'll give you that. It might be even more. Robin.
Just wondering if the nature of the income shock matters. You know, you're defining it based on AGI, but I could imagine that the lowest decile might be earnings, and the higher decile might be a shock to dividend payouts.
That's exactly the sort of thing that I'm looking for today. That is a great idea, and one we should definitely pursue. Based on the SCF and looking at the income shocks in the SCF, they're really driven by the labor income, especially if you expand it to include business income as sort of a quasi-labor. But yes, that's an excellent point. All right, so marital shocks. Again, the blue line is not going to change, right? The neither shock is not going to change. That's the same line throughout. And what this tells us, although you guesstimate these coefficients precisely, the pattern is something you have to kind of visually look through. It's not clear that these 2 points are that, really tell you that people in the fourth and fifth quintiles are very different, or deciles are very different than everybody else. But I think my main takeaway from this is it's still the case that marital shocks, on average, make it much more likely that you take money out of your account relative to people who have no shocks. But here you see less of a pattern by income. In other words, a marital shock raises the probability of accessing your account at all income levels. And in fact, if you look closely, it might even be a little bit higher for the highest income group. There may be some sorting, and this is one of the things we're working on, which is, do you have a group down here of people, of divorcees whose income suddenly fell, who got the shock, and that's why they're in the bottom income group. And so if you look at the interaction, there's some evidence this might be true. So this is people who experience both the income shock and the marital shock. You see, this is where you get your highest rates of withdrawal in this first decile. And there's still a downward sloping pattern, but again, it's not quite as clear, not quite as strong as it is for just income. So these three, or these observations about the income shocks and marital shocks, as I said, affirm what we expected to find. And it goes back to this premise that in designing a system like this, you would probably want to acknowledge that people are going to react to certain types of events in their life by wanting to access their funds. It's the least bad alternative under certain circumstances. But the other thing that comes out of these pictures is the blue line. The blue line tells us that across all income groups we see fairly high tendencies to take taxable withdrawals regardless of whether you had this shock or not. Now, there may be other shocks out there we haven't identified yet, and this is one of the things when we get to questions, I really am very interested in other ideas about how you might understand the circumstances, other things you'd want to test about circumstances under which people might take withdrawals from their accounts. But just looking at this, it doesn't seem that shocks are really driving a lot of the sort of total withdrawals that occur in a given year. One way to think about it, So taxpayers experiencing the shocks are more likely to have the withdrawal as expected. But 12% of those experiencing no shocks also had some sort of taxable withdrawal. So given the 16% overall withdrawal rate, one way to think about this, the shocks explain maybe a fourth of the withdrawals, these shocks that we've identified. And the question is the remaining withdrawal activity due to other shocks we just haven't found yet? Or is this where the role for policy change starts to become more evident? So I do want to do one thing before we get to that kind of wrap up and talking about the policy, which is to redo the entire exercise, but this time by this 3-year average of income, just to see how it changes things. And it actually does. It's why we put both into the paper. It doesn't change the blue line very much, right? So the blue line, the no shocks line, is again, if anything, a little bit flatter across income groups. You see that this tendency to take taxable withdrawals is strong for all groups who have access to their accounts regardless of income. And the slope of the income pattern changes a little bit. It's still much higher at that experiencing an income shock makes it much more likely you're going to take money out of your account, but the differences across income are not quite as stark. The marital shock looks a lot like it did before. It raises things, not nearly as much as an income shock, but it does make it more likely that you'll access an account. And then overall, if you have both shocks, you experience both shocks. Again, we see sort of a flat pattern up until that last decile. So what does the average income tell us? How does it affect the story? That these income shocks are much more evenly spread across the distribution, obviously. And so the effect of the income shocks is going to be more spread as well. But again, 12% of the taxpayers with coverage who experienced no income or no marital shocks also took withdrawals. And so I would say this, and again, I'd say this more appropriate classifier reinforces the observation that high withdrawal rates are really pervasive. They're not confined to just lower income. So this gets back to that distributional story, and we saw some difference if we go all the way back to that slide. I think I can get back there. Where are we? This slide, where we looked at the difference between what you have at a point in time, what's flowing in for an income group, and what their balances are at a point in time. There are some differences here. Lower income people have lower balances relative to their contributions than higher income people, but it's not that dramatic. So this sort of behavior, this accessing of retirement accounts is more pervasive, more widespread than I would have guessed going in before starting this project. This is, every time we start digging into this tax data, Victoria and I have been at it for a couple years now. We've dragged Robert in, and there's lots more to do. I think the tax data is the way to see what's happening at an aggregate level with flows in and out of retirement accounts. One of the reasons why SOI IRS is very interested in this is to actually start publishing some of this data so that we actually get this data out there for other people to understand what's happening with retirement accounts. So part of what we're doing is trying to create these kind of IRS publications. But we want to extend the things that we're doing here, and all of the regressions I just showed you were for the year 2010. And one question that you might be asking, I showed you lines where there wasn't much of an uptick in withdrawals. And then I showed you equations where the probability that you took a withdrawal was very much related to whether or not you had an income shock. And if you think about it, we know there were a lot of income shocks during the Great Recession. Are these two internally consistent, or was there a change in behavior conditional on having had a shock sometime over this period? So we're going to pool the regressions using all of the other years that we have data for when we build these panel type data sets for the other years, and think about was it something that changed in terms of people's response behavior, or is it just absolutely consistent that the way in which people reacted to income shocks was pretty stable, and we just gave them a few more income shocks in the Great Recession? At first blush, you might think that probably isn't going to add up because we know there were a lot more income shocks, so we might have expected to see a lot more withdrawals, but then this comes back to the other point Well, those withdrawal rates are high in every year regardless of shocks, so maybe that's not the important story. Maybe the important story is what happens to withdrawals not conditioned on a shock. The other thing that we're doing with the data, and this is, I had told you we want to extend what we're doing to age groups beyond 55. There's a lot of sort of popular press anecdotal stories about families truly getting close to retirement who, because of their circumstances, were forced to raid their retirement accounts in order to make ends meet. We weren't able to do that here, and part of the reason is when you get beyond age 55, the occurrence of defined benefit pensions starts to muddy the waters a little bit. There's not a lot of defined pension benefits below age 55, so we can do that. We know that from looking at the SCF, but after age 55, they become a much bigger share. And so this is where the tax data, you learn to love and hate the tax data at the same time, because the one thing the tax data doesn't tell you is what type of pension the money is coming out of, whether it's a regular DB type pension that you're getting a benefit from, or whether it's a DC type account that you've taken a withdrawal from. So our strategy is to use this panel approach and to do the following, to say that a DB is something that we would see that's recurring, coming from the same. We actually have a code for the institution or the employer who's making the payment. So is it coming from the same person? It's a recurring, and it also would have to be coded on the tax form as being a partial payment, and it would also be a non-penalized payment. And then the other distributions, if we can take the DB payments out, we can study the other distributions. These are the true lump sum or withdrawal payments, and we can actually start looking at people as they're getting closer to retirement. So this is our, in fact, that's probably fair to say the top part is finishing the current paper, and I think it's fair to say this is our next paper. And once we've done this, then you can start imagining using this tax data to answer all sorts of interesting questions that come up in behavioral economics. What happens to people? How do people react to a number of different types of circumstances? You can imagine job shock type circumstances where we can observe people looking who've experienced a job change. Again, the tax data tell us if the employer identification number on their W-2 changed. We see a big drop in their labor income. We can see how did they react. We can see what happens when you split an account, when you have a divorce, and we can see who had the account before the divorce by tracking the two people back in time, and then seeing how each of the parties responded to receiving their half of the account. So lots of really interesting type of behavioral studies that can be done with the tax data, even though it's not really designed to do this. It's just it's the way it's a way of getting at it and having really viable measures of these sorts of withdrawals in a really useful representative data set. Having said that, the one thing that's not on here is something, and Ann and I chatted about again this morning, and I know I've talked to other people in the room about it, that what I think we find here suggests that these sorts of questions are really important because withdrawals are substantial. They are something we should be worried about. And the new information that comes out is that there doesn't seem to be a particular shock, or at least the two shocks we looked at, that is driving the preponderance of this withdrawal behavior. And what that does, that really opens the door for finding out what it is that causes people to access their accounts early. And why it is it's so pervasive across the income distribution. It's not just concentrated to low income. And this is where studies, hopefully that can be put in place, hopefully a study like this motivates other studies that look further at people's decision making when they get access to their money. And so that's not on this last slide, but I think something that hopefully somebody will take on at some point in the future.
Your work really reminded me of the work that one of my previous colleagues has done, Steve Venti and Wise, had actually this paper that really shows that across the income distribution, you can find that people save little, right? So in a sense, this lack of saving is very pervasive, And also what we see is kind of this richness of behavior that really emerge as soon as you look at the microdata. And I just wanted you to elaborate perhaps on the richness of data, because what you have here is so remarkable. And also perhaps the implication for policy. I mean, one of my concern about policy is how much one size fits all it
Right.
is, and it does not going to be effective if we continue to use this approach of one size fits all.
Right. I mean, the dramatic thing that comes out of this is just how pervasive withdrawals really are. I guess I came into this because of having read Venti and Wise and others and looking at differences in saving rates across income groups for a long time myself, expecting to see much higher withdrawal activity for lower income households. And you really see, this access to the accounts is much more pervasive across this group. I think when we start looking at dollar amounts, and maybe we go to an older age group, that might reinforce, why it is that balances are so skewed on the eve of retirement. But it wasn't quite as clear-cut as I might have expected. Yeah.
Great. Let me turn to the audience to see if there are other questions.
Two of the shocks that I think, they are not exactly shocks, but one of them at least, is that can you check on your on this data about health shocks? And health shocks, you can look at the deductibles, whether they have medical deduction, and that will give you an indication that maybe, broadly speaking, there is a shock.
Right.
And the second one will be about purchasing a house. Again, you will observe that from 1 year to the other. You observe that in the deduction.
Right. So you'll see the
those are
mortgage
two
deduction.
things that
Right.
you can
Right.
look at for people who, for now, they don't appear as if they didn't have a shock.
The ability to capture a health shock on the tax data is somewhat limited because of the AGI limit. So you only see health deductions if it goes above, is it 7.5%? Of AGI. So that's a pretty extreme health shock, and you're probably not going to see a lot. What you might see, and in fact this is from my work at CBO and doing the dynamic microsimulation, that when you see health shocks, it's often highly correlated with something else. So a drop in labor income in particular, among one of the two, so the primary or the secondary. So you might not be able to distinguish a job loss from a health shock or what caused the job loss, but I think you would see the end result as being a significant drop in labor income. And that's exactly where we're headed, the next steps in terms of being able to do this.
In trying to explain the 3 quarters left, the 12% of,
Right.
of distribution, taxable distribution, did you already look at the taxable distribution as a function of how large it is for the person? In other words, the what the hell, it's not going to help me effect, which is, and you would, of course, adjust that by income. Let's say
Right.
if it's less than 2% of your overall income, there's no point. This seems like small money for me. Because that's something that would hold across income.
So when I first got into this business, that's a great question. I have a paper with David Weiner from 1999. I think was the first time I looked at this, and we took the tax data, and one of the most important things that came out of that cross section snapshot, low distribution values are almost always cashed out. And so where you start getting into this from a policy perspective, what is low? And so if someone's making $20,000 a year, a $3,000 distribution is probably not low. If somebody's making $200,000, then it's pretty insignificant. So one of the directions we want to go is to document how the size of the gross distribution affects the taxable. The problem that you run into, and it gets into, again, this last slide, that how you're exactly measuring these things, that in the tax data, we don't see that you were suddenly presented with $3,000 and you had to make a decision. What we see is that there was a $3,000 taxable event. So that could have been, we might see that you were presented with $5,000 and cashed out $3,000 of it. But we might see somebody who was presented with $5,000 and took none of it out. But what we don't see is whether or not that we can't tell that this was a withdrawal versus a lump sum distribution. It's a subtle point, But if you intentionally make a withdrawal, then 100% of it is taxable. So to get at the question you want to answer, you want to see what happens if the employer shows them 1,000 versus 10,000. How does their response differ? And so that's exactly one of the things, the reason why we want to start splitting these into the different types of distributions. So again, it's interesting. It's a great lead-in for me to try and motivate other people who might be interested in these questions to try and start working with IRS. All of this work, I should mention, was done under what's called the Joint Researcher Program. So Victoria is an employee of the IRS, and she has access to the data. I'm not allowed to touch the tax data. As a taxpayer, you're probably glad to hear that. But this program, every couple of years, they have a call for proposals. And if you have ideas like this, you can come in, work with someone at IRS, to start processing the data. And so you start getting into it, and this is where you start thinking about the possibilities of what you can do. So how would you identify the event you're trying to characterize? You would need to take a W-2, find that the person had changed jobs, and then identify the gross distribution and say, that was very likely a gross distribution associated with that job change. Then you look at their taxable response to that gross distribution. So again, this is exactly the sort of project that IRS is very interested in, and those of us who study financial literacy are very interested in. And if there's people in the audience who want to pursue questions like that, by all means, I encourage you to look into this program.
I know in the paper you've demonstrated across a number of years these high levels of withdrawals across the different deciles, but just because you're focusing on 2010, it just raised a question in my mind. Is conversion to Roth, is that considered a taxable distribution?
Right, and you can see that they're not a huge chunk even in 2010. Did we have the conversion to Roth? No, we have returned non-taxable distributions from Roth. So let me put that on my list to do. Do you know how big conversions were in 2010?
No, but the issue was in 2010 and 2011 you had the
right. The one-time
the
possibility
ability,
of doing
exactly.
a conversion.
So did you see, I mean, you did see increases, at least from the tables I could see in your paper, there seemed to be increases in 2010, but I don't know whether that was part of...
So that probably would show up as a taxable distribution because it's a one-time event that was taxable. So the question is how big they are, and that could actually be, so what little uptick we have coming out of the recession could in part be driven by a change in tax law. That's a great point. Thank you.
Is there a way to look at, when you start looking at, maybe try to do some panel data to see how people have gone over time, and check also with their savings and whether or not they actually recorded more income from savings or capital gains or dividends? Because one of the things you're trying to figure out too is if someone gets close to being, say, 55 years old, 54, they lose their job, have an income shock, might they say, hey, I have my 401k here I can withdraw from, but I've also been saving up separately in a private savings account. Maybe I should withdraw that down first before hitting my retirement savings and hitting the penalty.
Right, and so that wonderful panel data set doesn't exist, and so what we're left with is combinations of really good cross-sections from a data set like the SCF, and then trying to do what we're doing here, which is building these retrospective panels, and I think trying to get at some of what you're talking about. So one way you might be able to see something like that would be that they had interest income in 1 year, and it fell dramatically if they had taken money out. So again, this is a great kind of question to take to the tax data at some point. I think the SCF is probably not too encouraging that your alternative response mechanism might be in play, largely because when we look at the fraction of households who have any liquid financial assets, it's not a large number, and there's a really strong income component to that as well. So so again, is this people reacting to so I guess I will take the opportunity to reinforce one of the points, which is, yes, the shocks are important, but there seems to be something else going on. So going back to where you started about retirement security, is the problem, is behavior undermining retirement security not because of shocks, but because of bad behavior, right? That people are doing this when they haven't experienced a shock, when in fact that's money that should be preserved. And is there something we can do to help preserve these funds, even if they're small distributions? Is there something we can do to help keep people rolling the money over? as they go through life.
So you have to distinguish. There are this small distribution that can show behavior, and then the big distributions that maybe are not behavior, but they are shocks that you don't observe.
And again, my only point, I would reemphasize what is small, right? So $3,000 might be small to one person, it might be large to somebody else. So, yeah. If you change jobs very frequently, it's and in fact, that's something we know when we think about labor market dynamics. That job turnover rates are very strongly negatively correlated with income. So if you're lower income, you're much more exposed to the possibility of accessing the funds. You might be much more likely to do so.
One other quick idea. Just trying to think through other methods that might bear out over income, such as the proportion of small to you, right? What about credit card debts or other debts that a person has? Is there any footprint of that you would see? I mean,
so we don't see that on the tax data, unfortunately. So that's you love and hate the tax data, and that's one of the things you don't see. And it's but this again is something where we might be able to look at something, and I turn to my co-author now, Robert, and say, is there something we can do in terms of retirement accounts and the existence of credit card debt? So maybe there's some possibility people are using their credit card payouts to, their retirement payouts to draw down their credit card debt. And were it not for the possibility that they could do that, would they have not run up the credit cards in the first place? Again, these are dynamic questions. I'm not sure we have the data to answer.
I want to continue a little bit on this point because it's really so important and also kind of links to the seminar we had 2 weeks before, which is, it does seem that, we do want to have a system that preserves this saving for that purpose of retirement. And some people have argued, should we really have a possibility for people to tap into this retirement? But if I look at your data, in a sense, some of these possibility might be good because we are experiencing sometime a big recession, or if you look at the data, there is a high proportion of people who use high-cost method of borrowing or credit cards. So can you say a little bit more on that?
So one of my answers to this is that if I had been writing a paper that was about saving accounts, you all would probably be applauding how rational people were, because they're using these accounts, they're putting money into an account, and then when they experience a shock, they respond rationally to that shock by drawing down their accounts. The problem is that we're and the reason why we're here is that this is not just their saving for this point in their life, this is their retirement fund. And so one way to answer this is to acknowledge people are going to experience shocks. We do want them to have access to the funds when they do. That helps encourage them to put the money in the first place. But maybe the lesson should be that they should be putting a little bit more in the first place, so that when they experience the shocks, they can access not necessarily all of the money. And so it's not completely divorced from all of the other financial literacy work that gets done on contribution rates. But when we think about simulating, modeling how much a given level of contributions is going to generate in terms of ultimate retirement incomes, we need to acknowledge that some of that money will leak out because of shocks. But again, having said that, the shocks themselves, at least the ones we've identified, although they're strong correlates, they're not accounting for everything that's happening. There's a lot of withdrawal activity that's happening that's not accounted for by the shocks. So that's where the possibility of some behavioral nudging on the withdrawal side might be important.
More questions? Jason?
Not in the tax data, and in fact, there is a measure that's in the tax data. One of the distribution codes is what's called a deemed distribution, and a deemed distribution occurs when someone has taken out a loan, separates from the plan, and then does not repay the loan. Right, so effectively, although they've received no money, they receive a notice from the IRS indicating that they owe a tax and a penalty on that loan amount. In practice, what tends to happen, the plan sponsors who people talk to say, they generally convert those and they report those as a normal distribution. So those people are actually probably showing up in our data as a normal taxable distribution. So we really can't discern how much of that's happening.
They would report it as a distribution when the loan was taken out, or when the loan was paid back.
When it wasn't paid back. So they sort of convert it to a taxable distribution at that point.
What would be the lag on that? Do they have a year, 2 years? So if we got a loan in 09, you didn't see it as a pattern.
I think it's a fairly short period that you have. Stephen Bash, you may know the answer.
Well, it's a short period after separation.
After separation, right.
If you take a loan that you pay it back over the course of 10 years, it's longer.
You have to get on a payment plan, but I think most people choose not to. This is based on conversations with people at Vanguard and places like that. Most people choose to say, hey, I can't pay this back, I just lost my job. And so they say, fine, we're not going to do it as a deemed, we'll do it as a normal taxable. So again, it's one of the deficiencies of the tax data that we can't see that. So.
And on that part, there actually might be not a good use of loan on those accounts because they don't provide insurance. The loan need to be repaid back if you leave the jobs. And so,
See somebody who, might want to say, I'll take a loan, and I've got time to pay it back, maybe take it, get a new job in 2 months, 3 months, eventually. But they just don't find it employment, so it's time to figure out what behavior.
I think most deemed distributions are not expected. It's because the person plans to pay it back and they separate from the employer and they're unable to.
and probably this is because you might be using the IRS data, but is there a way to classify this data across education rather than income?
No, that would be.
Education, I think,
right.
would really give you some idea as well about their capacity to manage this account.
Without a doubt. It's one of the things you'd love to see, and so one dreams about linked data being able to do things like this, but it's tough enough to get access to this data. So we take what you can get. Having said that, again, it reinforces the point about the average income, and if we can take these look-back panels even further, if we really believe there's a strong correlation between education and lifetime income, and we can get longer measures of income and really split people into groups where we would expect financial literacy to vary systematically across the groups, we might be able to start getting at that point.
More questions? Great. So actually, why don't we move to the reception where we can have the possibility to actually talk in more details about this, and also with John directly. And please join me in thanking John for really this important paper. I think it's important not just for research but also for policy. So look forward to seeing more work on this.